Hey, down here in the corner, over here. Hi, hi guys. Um, this is chapter 5, and we're gonna go through and look at just what's going on in chapter 5. Kind of a review for you. So I'm gonna skip through parts coming up about the war itself because we don't cover the war, like I told you guys in class today. So some of the highlights of this chapter are the States United, independence, the war for independence, war in society, the creation of the state government, and then search for a national government. So getting started here, we looked a little bit at common sense already today. But even before that, there was the Olive Branch Petition. And the Olive Branch Petition was really the last, Congress sent the last petition to the Crown in hopes for peace. And this was a year after Lexington and Concord, so after really the Revolutionary War got started, but really not too far into it. But the king totally refused the petition, but most of the population just kind of hoped the whole thing would blow over in the end. The king's response was to quell the rebellion and by force the English and tried to recruit slaves, Indian, and mercenaries as soldiers and blockaded all the American ports. Both Congress and the public became more radical over the course of the first year. However, sentiments for independence strengthened, especially in January of 1776 when Thomas Paine was Common Sense was distributed. It was published in 1776 by Thomas Paine. It was an advocated colonial independence, touted the merits of the republicanism over a monarchy, getting rid of the king, and most of the people who were literate of the time, still over 100,000 copies of this sold in the first few months of its printing. So it was a very widely read document, and it was well taken in the colonies. The Declaration of Independence. As imperial governments crumbled, the colonies established governments a part of the British authority. Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence in 1776, July 4th, 1776. It was written mainly by Thomas Jefferson, but he had help from, he brought a lot from John Locke, but also had help from John Adams as well. And it adopted, move on here. Its adoption made America a sovereign nation, but the resistance to independence continued. Loyalists, also called Tories by the Patriots, remained loyal to the king, and the former colonies, now states, began to write their own constitutions, and were sovereign as a new national government. And the Articles of Confederation that were created were ratified in 1781, and this government was relatively weak, and it was also very decentralized. With the war happening, we had to mobilize for it some way and had to support ourselves. So the greatest challenge that we faced was keeping a well-equipped military and army in the field. And also we had to figure out how to pay for it. Foreign nations, like France, came to aid, provide a bunch of the financing for the war, and the government could not force states to provide money or troops, and had difficulty selling bonds, and thus resorted to just printing their own paper money. And inflation was a huge result of that. The colonial army depended heavily on weapons captured by the British. And as the war continued on, patriotism faded, and the nation had a lot of difficulty raising troops. Finally, George Washington, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, was mainly responsible for keeping the army and the nation together before he became president. There was a lot of advantages and disadvantages, and really the first phase here, which I'm going to go through relatively quick. But remember, too, the whole war itself was a social and political issue. Yes, there's part of the war of the military side that's very important, don't get me wrong, but for our world, we're not going to go into that very much. The first phase, mostly in New England, the British were uncertain about the weather, about whether it was a war. Maybe it was really just kind of, they thought it was more of a rebellion, but ultimately it became clear that England must be prepared to fight a very large conflict. The second phase in the Mid-Atlantic region was the best position for England for a victory. More traditional and conventional war. In the north, it was a lot of more guerrilla warfare in New England. And the British made many mistakes and surrendered at Saratoga, which was a huge turning point and really brought the colonists even closer together after that. And the last part, the final phase in the South, this was very different from the first two. The British had new limits on the commitment, decided to try to enlist loyalists to undermine from within, so we didn't really know who our enemy was. Thought loyalists were strong in the South but failed to rally support, especially when they encouraged Southern slaves to desert from their homeland. And then also, too, the ending just in Yorktown was where they were all captured. Okay. War and society. Where do I go? Okay, right there. You can see the picture here of the tar and feathering, which was very common at this point in time. The revolution was was a much more political and social revolution than anything else. Many Americans remained loyal to Britain, and many were forced to flee the country, some leaving behind large estates and possessions of authority in the former colonies. Although the loyalist property was confiscated, the distribution of wealth did not change dramatically. The Anglican Church was disestablished, and many Anglican clergy left. The Quaker pacifism also weakened that sect as well. The position of the Catholic Church improved dramatically as Catholic patriots such as Charles Carroll and with alliance with the Catholic France gave that Catholicism a new validity in America. And Maryland's John Carroll became the first American bishop in 1789. Not that that's really that important there. Okay, excuse me. I need to take a share of Pepsi, not a Coke. All right, moving on. Tensions existed between the ideal of liberty and slavery, so there are huge issues with slavery as well. Excuse me one second. Some gained freedom by escaping and joining the British, and others increased exposure to the concept of liberty during this time period. And whites opposed British efforts for emancipation, but also feared patriot ideology might prompt slave revolts. In the North, the revolutionary ideas combined with the evangelical Christianity to spread anti-slavery sentiments in the South. In the Southern Church developed rationale that painted slavery as an essential to liberty in the United States and the liberty of whites. Native Americans, both sides urged them to stay neutral on both sides of it, not to take one side or the other. Some, including the Iroquois, joined the British because the devil they knew was better than the devil they didn't know. The war weakened the position of them. The Patriot victory led to increased white demand for Western lands. White attitudes toward any tribe really worsened during this period, and fighting still continued between Indians and natives. Women's rights. Some had to run farms or businesses during the time period, while the men were at the war. Many became impoverished, especially in cities and towns. Some became camp as the war progressed on, the increasing numbers known as camp followers joined the camps of the Patriot Army, which was very common. This was really the first call for women's rights in the United States. And Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Women's Rights of Women in 1792 articulated those ideas. And lastly, the concept of Republican motherhood is formed. And this is important. Republican motherhood, additional value placed on the role of women as mothers. The nation was producing a new kind of citizen steeped in the principles of liberty. Mothers were important instructors for their children, teaching them the virtues of Republican citizenry, and was expected to possess in their later life. Creations of state governments. The state constitutions became very big in order to move the country forward. The revolution produced state governments with power vested in virtuous land-holding white men. The belief was that the Constitution should be written for each state. Power of the executive must be limited because they did not want to have one central figure. They did not want to have the king like it was ruling before. They did not want to have one person in charge of it, so they put more power into the state. Mostly had bicameral legislatures. Massachusetts created a constitutional convention. And Virginia enacted the Statute of Religious Liberty in 1796, which completely separated church and state. And slavery survived in all border states and all southern states. Okay. The last part I want to go through with you here is the search for a national government. And really, this is the Articles of Confederation that were created. As the war raged with England, many sought to a weak national government with sovereignty resting in the states. They want to have state power. And that result was the Articles of Confederation that were adopted in 1777. They were finally ratified in 1781. The government had little authority and no executive power. It could not regulate trade, tax, or raise any type of army. That had to all be done by the state. And each state had a single vote, and a majority of the 9 was necessary to approve any bill. Its record was mixed during its existence from 1781 to 1789. The Confederation commanded little respect in the world. We didn't have a lot of power overseas. And after Britain continued to violate aspects of the Treaty of Paris, the full access to the English markets were never achieved. And after the war, important accomplishment was the resolution of Western land issues. And this is where you'll see the resolution of 1785. The Ordinance of 1785 created a system of surveying and selling lands in rectangular sections, and in 1787, the Northwest Ordinance provided settlement of government of the Northwest Territory, and that territory is not like Washington and Oregon that you know today. That's the Michigan and Indianas and Ohio's of the world. A post-war depression also occurred and exposed the economic weaknesses of the nation. Without the ability to tax, the Confederation could not pay its debts, and the states increased taxes to pay their debts. Here you can see the Western lands, how they're split up, and this is in your book as well, of how they split up into territories. And the last part, after the states couldn't pay their debts, and the states had to start increasing taxes, Massachusetts farmers, pressed by higher taxes, joined Daniel Shea in Shea's Rebellion, who was a Western Massachusetts farmer and veteran who closed courts to prevent farmers from losing their property. With the national government unable to act, the revolt was extinguished and the local militia financed by wealthy merchants. The rebellion exposed fundamental weaknesses in the government and strengthened the movement to revise the Articles. And this is where you start to see the beginning of the idea of a new constitution being created. So that's all I got for you today. I will see you guys tomorrow. Take care.